This episode of the Lament configuration is dedicated to George Romero. Rest in peace. Welcome to the worst nightmare of all, the Lament Configuration Horror Podcast. I'm Greg Knox, and I'm joined by an explorer in the further regions of experience, demon to some, angel to others, Rawhead.
Hi Greg, thanks for the intro. And your suffering will be legendary, even in hell.
Oh, looking forward to that very much. I'm sure I'll be going there when I die. So, as you probably guessed, because our show is called The Lament Configuration, obviously we are huge fans of Hellraiser. And this year marks the 30th anniversary of Hellraiser being released into cinemas. So over the next two shows, what we're going to do is we're going to cover all 9 Hellraiser films from beginning to end, which... Hey, I'm really looking forward to that. But first, because just to let you guys know that obviously because we're discussing the films in great detail, there are going to be quite a lot of spoilers, but also the other things that come with our show. So Rhea, why don't you take it away with our usual warning?
Okay, and maybe I'll make it Hellraiser themed, as that is the theme of our show.
Oh, okay. So go ahead.
Okay. Warning, the following broadcast may contain Hellraiser spoilers, extreme language, violence, and topics considered graphic or adult, not for those of a sensitive disposition.
Yes, exactly. So, our show is called The Lament Configuration. I am a huge fan of Hellraiser. Hellraiser is, to me, sort of, as someone who is originally from the north, it's a very personal film to us. I mean, I don't know about you, Rhea. I mean, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I feel like it's up there in my favourite franchises, and the first one being one of my favourite horror films. It certainly left a mark on me in terms of inspiring my love for horror, and everyone remembers their first watch of the first Hellraiser film. It's something that I watched sort of in my early teens, I think, growing up, and I definitely did not forget it.
Okay. Now, interestingly, I didn't actually see Hellraiser. The first Hellraiser film I saw was Hellraiser 3, which is a very weird way to kind of experience Hellraiser for the first time. So we had Sky in my house, and when I was growing up, I used to watch all these horror movies, which kind of explains why I am the way I am now. And yeah, that was the first one that I ever saw. So I didn't actually see Hellraiser, the first one, until much later on. So yeah, very weird kind of how these things turn out. So sequels do actually serve a purpose after all. But yeah, as said, I absolutely love it. It's had a very sort of large effect on me, and it's probably my favourite of all the big franchises. Even some of the later sequels, which we will go into, there's still like a certain charm to them, I think, anyway. I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree that there was such a huge cult following of Hellraiser, and it made such an impact that they just wanted to continue that and honour the fans with sort of further sightings of Cenobites and everything that they love about the first one. And we are going to discuss the first and second, which I think are awesome films, but particularly the first one, which is by far the most iconic and my favourite of the whole franchise.
Yeah, so it kind of goes without saying that it's my favourite as well. So this is Hellraiser, obviously. And it's directed by Clive Barker, and it's based on his own novella, which is The Hellbound Heart, which he kind of wrote at the same time he was producing the screenplay for this. Now, Barker is obviously quite a famous horror novelist, and his most famous kind of work, The Books of Blood, had come out a few years previously, and he had been asked to write screenplays based on adaptations of his work. So there was a film called Underworld, but more infamously, there was a film called Rawhead Rex. Rhea, have you heard of either of those films?
I've heard of them both, but I haven't yet watched them. How do you rate them?
I haven't seen Underworld, but I have seen Rawhead Rex, and Rawhead Rex is kind of just a bit of a shit monster movie. Because to say, Barker wrote the screenplay, but what happens is, when you make a film, obviously you will write stuff on the page, but then what the director or the producers choose to then do with that is another story, and Barker really hated the end result of Rawhead Rex. It's just a very silly monster film, and the monster looks fucking shit. I'm not gonna lie.
this was his really early work then, yeah?
Yeah. So it's the first screenplays that he did, although it's not actually the first films that he's directed. So Hellraiser is his first full-length film, but he had made shorts with his theatre company called The Dog Company. So one of those is called Salom, and another one is called The Forbidden, which star Doug Bradley, interestingly. So Clive Barker and Doug Bradley are actually really, really good friends. They've been friends for years, even pre-Hellraiser. They've known each other for a very long time. But yeah, so as I said, this is his first full-length film, and I think he did a really, really good job with it, since by his own admittance in interviews, he had no idea really what he was doing, and it's really due to the sort of the crew that he had around him that he did as well as he did.
It's fucking amazing. So this is a 1987 film. God, I love 80s horror. So, especially as we're getting quite late in the 80s there, and it was quite developed. There was a lot of like really cool horror coming to the surface at that time. The synopsis is: an unfaithful wife encounters the zombie of her dead lover. Demons are pursuing him after he escaped the sadomasochistic underworld.
So, as you said, this is at heart a love story. Now, having seen all 9 films, the one thing that I think kind of sets this apart is that the story is very, very kind of lean and mean, and it's a love story. So, when people talk about Hellraiser, obviously they closely associate it with Pinhead, but really the Cenobites are actually an incidental element in this film.
Yeah, it all revolves around Julia and Frank, which is her... Frank, which is her dead lover.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a really, really fucked up sort of love triangle. So as you said, we have Frank Cotton, who is sleeping with his brother's wife, which makes him the Ryan Giggs of his day. So he gets the box, and he does what most people do in these films, and he opens the box. Although in this film, he actually opens the box for a reason, and then... in the novella, interestingly, like when he opens the box, he talks to the Cenobites and he experiences like all this very intense sort of pleasure and pain, which isn't really kind of covered that much in the film for like sort of obvious reasons. Now, one of the interesting things about this film is that it's got this weird kind of displacement. Now, one of the sort of controversies of the film is kind of, is the film supposed to be set in England or is it supposed to be in America? Because if you look at the locations, particularly there's a scene where you've got Kirsty kind of walking along the Thames, and it's obviously the Thames because you can see Battersea Power Station in the background.
Yeah, I definitely thought it was supposed to be set in England because there are a lot of British accents and the house looks very English, don't you think?
Well, there are a lot of American accents. So you've got Claire Higgins, who's obviously very, very English, but everyone else seems to be American. So they've dubbed sort of Sean Chapman's voice, so he's American. That weird guy who is Kirsty's love interest, Steve,
yeah,
he is given a really shit American accent, and he is probably the worst character in the whole film, purely because of the dubbing, I think.
Yeah, I totally noticed the shit American accent, and that did make me think, oh, hang on a minute, aren't we in the UK here? And then I was like, well, they've obviously just got some American actors that they wanted to work on this, and they've just gone with it instead of making everybody sort of be forced to have a British accent if they don't have one. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a little confusing, but the house does look very British, so it's very relatable to us.
Yeah, the house is very British. So the house is kind of, it's in Cricklewood, I believe, from sort of interviews and documentaries that I've seen. And yeah, the house is actually still there. So there are people actually living in that house kind of as we speak. So probably blissfully unaware as to sort of the fact it was used for like this very violent horror movie. So as we mentioned earlier, the main crux of the story is this weird love triangle. So you've got Larry, who's played by Andrew Robinson, who is most famous for being the Scorpio killer in Dirty Harry, and he's very good at playing psychopathic sort of characters, as we see in this film. I suppose you'll agree with that.
So he's Julia's husband,
Yep.
and she's the star of the film.
Yeah, so Claire Higgins, I think, gives the best actual acting performance in this film because it's quite interesting. Like, there isn't really a central character in the film because you've got Larry, but he's sort of more of a side character, even though Andrew Robinson is given sort of top billing. It's really kind of Julia, who I think is sort of the lead, really.
Yeah, and then And then with Frank is like a huge part of it, obviously, but like you say, it is this weird love triangle.
Yeah, and Larry, I mean, bless him, he doesn't really do anything wrong, but you can kind of tell that him and Julia, like, obviously they haven't had a very good marriage sort of so far. There's obviously all this tension. Well, probably doesn't help that, like, she slept with his brother on their wedding dress as well, which I thought was a very kinky touch. I did enjoy that.
On their wedding night or on their wedding dress?
Well, on the wedding dress, but I think it's supposed to be just before the wedding itself.
Oh, okay.
So from there, what happens is they've moved into this house, which is Larry and Frank's grandmother's house. And sort of moving forward in the story a bit, what happens is that Larry is moving in and he cuts himself, and it's very graphic, where he cuts his hand on a nail and the blood from his hand drips all over the floor in this sort of old room.
Yeah, it's an awesome scene. That nail, when he rips his hand, still makes me look away, the way the suspense is built up.
Yeah, it's done in a really, really cool way. As you say, there's a lot of tension built up, and yes, it's very, very grisly that, like, he gets his hand caught on this random nail, and that leads to sort of one of the centerpiece scenes of the whole film, which is the resurrection of Frank scene.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, now it's say very, very, very cool effects, definitely. And the effects for this film, they had a huge team, but were led by Bob Keane, who is more well known for his work on the first 3 Star Wars films and Alien. So very top level kind of special effects guy. And yeah, the special effects in this film, for the most part, are really awesome, particularly in this scene where you've got sort of all the sort of the guts and all the blood and the bones kind of coming out of the floorboards.
It's almost like a spider sort of creature that comes up, the way that he emerges.
Yeah, it just looks so eerie. Now, I saw this in kind of a little bit less good quality kind of version. I also saw it in HD, and it actually works very well in HD. You would think that HD would actually kind of ruin the effects, but it actually didn't at all. It actually really added to it, because you can actually see it looks really, really realistic, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of like kind of slime, blood, flesh and bone. It's very effective. It's very disgusting looking. And when he comes back, he's really dramatic, and he's like, please, God, help me.
Yeah, exactly. So, as I say, that looked very, very, very awesome. And it's quite interesting because in documentaries I've seen, this scene was not actually originally in the script that Barker wrote. Tony Randall, who he was the director of Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, he was sort of brought in uncredited to do editing on this film. He actually kind of asked for it to be added to the film because the company, New World, gave them more money to add it to the film. So this actually wouldn't have been in the film originally. So,
wow.
Which is a shame because, yeah, I think what he felt is that, well, Frank comes back, but it's like we need to give it some oomph. So, yeah, they kind of insisted that got added.
Yeah, it definitely is a turning point in the film as well. It really, like, brings the point home. It's so dramatic and it's so disgusting looking. And even though the effects do look a little dated there, it just still works so well.
Mm. Absolutely. And then we get the scene afterwards where we actually see what Frank looks like post kind of regeneration. And again, it's very, very, very disgusting, like in a good way, if there is such a thing, where you see, Frank, and he's literally just pretty much all bones and probably mucus. There's no sort of actual flesh on his bones yet. And how they did that was, it's not actually the actor who plays Frank when he's a human. There's actually a different actor, a very, very skinny guy who they got to play Frank in his sort of monster form, called Oliver Smith. And yeah, it's him basically in all the prosthetic makeup, and he is actually Frank probably more than Sean Chapman is, interestingly. And
wow.
I thought he gave a really good performance in this, actually.
Oh yeah, he's amazing. I mean, they do use that technique a lot throughout all of the films, where they have Cenobites played by a different actor to the human version of the Cenobite. Or they have skinless versions of humans that have been tortured, or in a similar sense to Frank, where they're either on the way to being a Cenobite or they're coming back from it. They're in some kind of state of limbo, played by other actors, or sometimes it's the same actor as the human.
So now, interestingly, very early on, we have the character of Kirsty, who is played by Ashley Lawrence, introduced into the film. Now, Kirsty in the novella was actually a friend of Larry. And, she's just a friend. She's kind of in the friend zone, as they say. And that's really kind of all she was. But I think they made the right decision in kind of making her like Larry's daughter from the previous marriage instead. But her character wasn't very, very well developed in the novella. And kind of the point that I'm getting to is a lot of the elements that I don't really like in this film, of which there are not that many, but there are certain things that do bother me, even though I love the film. And one of which, a lot of them are scenes that involve her. So, for example, in the film, it's 3 separate occasions. We have a random sort of vagrant who appears.
Oh yeah, he appears like often throughout the franchise, doesn't he? And I'm always like, who is this guy?
Yes, and he was not in the novella, you'll be surprised to hear. So I really don't see the purpose that he actually serves, other than to be a bit disgusting. So there's a scene where he eats crickets, which is lovely.
Oh yeah,
I fucking hate crickets anyway, so...
Yeah, I noted that down, and I also thought it was just one scene in the film where it's like just put in for effect and there's no real... You're kind of led to be thinking, is he like a prophecy? What's going to happen? How does he connect with this? And then it's never satisfied. So I agree with you that was a little irritating. Effective, but yeah, a little irritating. Although I can't really fault this film. Like, I don't like to say anything negative about the first Hellraiser because I love it.
Yeah, no, I love it too. I love it. It's my favourite by far of all the films. However, it's not a perfect film, and that's okay, because that's what we're here to discuss. And that was, as I say, one of the elements that I didn't really like about it. Ashley Lawrence is okay. I don't think she's amazing, but compared to sort of the acting sort of that the other main characters give, I think she's a little bit of a step below, which is kind of unfortunate because her character then obviously becomes very prominent in the next film. But, as I think she does okay. I think she does pretty good. I think her character is just unfortunately just a little bit underwritten compared to how important that she is. Let's put it that way. So, Hellraiser is kind of a body count film, would you say?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we've assigned ourselves the epic task of watching all 9, and I have done my best to record the deaths in all 9 films. As I say, we're just starting with the first 2. So yeah, I think they are body count films. Although it's not your traditional slasher, it kind of is in a way, and there's a lot of death to record. So I had my work cut out for me. Let's just say that.
Although, interestingly, Doug Bradley, in an interview, he actually said if you take the Cenobites out of Hellraiser, it is basically a generic slasher film. So he agrees with you.
It's a supernatural slasher. So yeah, it took me a while to realise that because there's so much else going on. And it's not really that traditional setup, but it's just, this is what makes this film, so different and why it stood out at the time, because it's not the formulaic slasher, but it still is. It's still got those great qualities to it.
Yes, so Frank basically needs people to die so that he can regenerate his body. So he asked Julia, bring me people and kill them for me, and that's exactly what she does.
Yeah, she does. So I've recorded all the deaths in this film. I'll summarise because I want us to, sort of compare between the different films as well, which ones have high body counts and which ones maybe have more average across the films. So I think they're all quite high. This one's got 8 in it, as far as I have recorded.
Mm-hmm.
So the first actual death is Frank himself, as in when he gets sent to hell. So he's torn apart by chains when he opens the box, and that's our first death.
Yeah, and as I said, it's very quick because, as everyone will kind of know, near the end of the film, there's a very, very similar death, and they didn't want to blow their load too early, as they say.
Yeah. I've then I've researched online, and as far as I know, there's another website here that's recorded Mrs. Cotton, who's an unknown female, and she gets killed next. But what I have here is that Julia goes to the airport or somewhere that looks like that, and she finds her first victim that he's asked her to find. And he's called Prudhoe.
Yes. So this is a guy, anyone who's seen the film, he's the guy with the weak bladder. So, yeah. So he's basically the first guy, and you can tell like he's a little bit kind of unsure as to what he's doing. He kind of really, really wants to fuck Julia. I don't know, it's really weird. Like, so in this film, all the male characters really, really seem to want to have sex with Julia. Not really sure why, not really my type, but hey, beauty's in the eye of the beholder and all that. Clearly, in the 80s, she might have been some kind of sex goddess, for all I know. But yeah, so he really, really wants to have sex with her, but she's kind of unsure because she knows that she's going to kill him. And you can see, like, kind of the hesitancy to kind of go ahead because she's going to kill this guy, basically. And he is a bit of a dum-dum, I'm not going to lie. So if you were bringing someone home and they took you up to this room and it's really dingy and filthy and there are rats everywhere and there's no bed, there's not even any furniture in there whatsoever, and like someone wanted to have sex with you, you'd be a bit suspicious. You'd be like, yeah, you really want to fuck here? Okay, fine. So he gets killed with a hammer to the head, which is pretty violent.
He does, but hey, she's the height of 80s fashion, and she's a good-looking woman, so she does seem to pick up these guys very easily.
Yes.
So yeah, she bludgeons him with a hammer and then drains the blood for Frank. We then move on to this carries on with what she's doing because she needs to obviously collect a few for Frank to regain his strength. So she then, I've noted down here, is a white vest man.
Yeah.
So I've got here, like, it's just a male victim. I'm not sure he has a name. He has the same thing done to him, so she hits him with the hammer, drains the blood.
Yep.
And next I have Stanley Sykes, and he's wearing a suit, so there's a suited man with glasses. And he actually gets, she bludgeons him with a hammer, but then Frank drains the blood.
Yes, and what happens at this point is Kirsty has been asked by her dad to kind of, go to the house because Julia is acting really weird, as you probably would, for obvious reasons. And Kirsty basically sees everything that's going on. And yeah, she comes in and sees that Frank has come back and he's killed this poor guy who has the immortal line, "Don't let him kill me," basically, that he comes out with.
And it's the first time we hear the uttering of Jesus Christ, which brings us to a famous line in the film. Later on, there's quite a lot of exclaiming about Jesus, like from time to time in this franchise, and it becomes a bit of a running theme.
Yeah. And what happens then is Kirsty then basically takes the box, the Lament configuration box, steals it from Frank because he obviously really, really wants it. She ends up in hospital, and essentially she opens the box, as everyone in this franchise does. They don't question why they're doing it, they just seem to do it without thinking. Which brings us to the Cenobites, who appear for the very, very first time in the franchise, which is very weird that, like I say, the Cenobites are what everyone remembers, but yet in this film they appear really, really late in the film. I think they appear about an hour into the film, so...
Yeah, I noticed that on this time when I watched it. I thought, wow, I thought that they came in a lot sooner than that, but you just focused on Frank, and I really feel like it's enough. It does seem like, looking back on this, that they would have been in it more, but you're right, it's only like halfway through that they turn up.
Yes, so you've got obviously Doug Bradley playing, as in the credits of this film, lead Cenobite, so he's not actually even called Pinhead yet at this point. We have the Butterball Cenobite, who's played by Simon Bamford, who is a friend of Clive Barker, and we have the Chatterer Cenobite, who is played by Nicholas Vince, who is also a friend of Clive Barker, and we have the female Cenobite, who's played by Grace Kirby, who of the four is the only one who doesn't appear in Hellbound, because apparently she didn't have a very good time making this film, so she decided not to appear in the next one. Now, very, very interesting talking point. So the novella, the Cenobites, are now... Some people misinterpret this. I've seen videos where people talk about differences between Hellbound Heart and Hellraiser, and they say, oh, in the novella, Pinhead is actually a woman. That's not actually true. So in the novella, the way that Barker describes the Cenobites is they're kind of sexless. So they're almost gender fluid. So we had gender fluidity in 1987, where they aren't really any sex. So they could be male or female. They're very formless. So, Interestingly, we could, in theory, have had, like, a female Pinhead, which would have been very, very interesting, I think.
Yeah, I don't think it would have been as strong myself, but I see what you mean about the gender fluidity. Because like even in also in some of the sequels, it's difficult to distinguish sometimes, obviously because you can't tell by the face. And if the build is more kind of neutral and not obvious, then you wouldn't really be able to tell what gender it was, and it probably wouldn't really matter that much. Like from the suits, like if you had a very slender tall female playing Pinhead, and similar build of guy playing Pinhead, it would probably work just as well. I think it's his voice that makes it, isn't it? Like with a masculine voice.
Oh, definitely, yeah. He's got an amazing voice. Anyone who's heard Midian by Cradle of Filth, there's a couple of other albums that he appears on, like he's got his awesome voice kind of on there. And yeah, his voice definitely makes the character, absolutely. Although, of the Cenobites, I gotta say, yes, Pinhead is the one who does most of the talking, but I actually find the Chatterer Cenobite very, very eerie and very scary, because it's a thing with chattering teeth and it's very ominous, and like, yeah, I always found him, like, when I first saw it, he was the one I actually found the most scary.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I do find Pinhead the most scary, but the Chatterer is very close behind. It is just so creepy that he's doing that constantly. It's kind of a really subtle noise, but at the same time, it's just so creepy.
Yeah, definitely. So what happens is, Kirsty opens the box. They're like, the box, you opened it, we came. And essentially they say, we want to take you to hell. And she's like, don't want to go to hell, actually. There's this guy I know called Frank. I believe you know him as well. He's escaped you. I will trade his soul for mine. And is that okay? And they're like, yep. Awesome. So they're happy with that. And what happens is, at this point, we're coming sort of quite close to the ending. So one of the things I love about this film is that it's actually, the pacing is really good. Like, the film goes so quickly because the story is just so good.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, how fast it goes? I'm quite impressed with how Kirsty was able to strike up this deal with them. And she seems very effective at doing that. She's like almost outsmarting them. She's like distracted them from what they were doing. And she's like, I've got something that you want. And then they accept, which you don't think is going to happen. You think they're just going to be like, no.
No, so it's kind of like, so this film has been described as a Faustian bargain film. So obviously you have Frank, he makes this Faustian bargain with the Cenobites where he wants to reach the outer limits of pleasure, as we say, and then they take his soul. But then, yeah, they offer the same bargain to Kirsty, and it's like, no, you can have this guy's soul instead. So yes, she definitely did outsmart them in that sense. Not the first time that she outsmarted the Cenobites, by the way. It's a common thread throughout the series.
Exactly. Which is what impresses me about her character, her ability to do that.
Yes, and then at this point, we're getting sort of near the end of the film, so what you have is Frank has essentially killed Larry and taken his skin, so now what you have is Andrew Robinson doing what he does best, which is playing a deranged psychopath, which he does very well in this film. So you've got him, and he comes out with some really amazing lines, one of which is so much for the cat and mouse shit, which is a great line.
Yeah. And that's so Larry's our sixth death, and he is skinned and smoking by the end of it. And I just wanted to add that it's just so satisfying as well, though, isn't it? Because you kind of want to just get rid of him. Like, in some kind of weird way, I just wanted Julia and Frank to be together because it's made you want that for them, even though it's so, like, fucked up. So, you know, because it's so, with this film, I think what's great about it is you get so into the characters. Like, they're so interesting and everything that's going on.
Yeah, no, like I said earlier, like Larry, he didn't really do anything wrong. He was just he met the wrong woman, shall we say. He wanted probably a more straight-laced woman than kind of what he ended up with, I think. So poor Larry, he's kind of, just gets killed and skinned.
Yeah, glad to see the back of him.
Oh, poor Larry.
So at first I'm like, wow, Frank's his brother and he's doing that, he's like stealing his wife. But then I was just like, yeah, no, actually, like, I think we need to get rid of Larry here.
And then, very predictably, although it does make sense in terms of the story, because obviously Frank is using Julia just to get him his skin back, and then once he's back, then he doesn't really have any use for Julia anymore. Although very, very kind of perverse scene actually just before this is once it's clear that Frank has taken Larry's skin and put it on, him and Julia actually have sex, which is very, very kinky. So Frank then stabs Julia, accidentally on purpose.
In the stomach, and then he realizes, and he said, "Oh, nothing personal, babe." And she's just like, "What?" She's just like, "I can't believe this." It's just so dismissive, isn't it? He's like, "Yeah, I don't really care."
Yeah, which actually gets played off in the next film actually quite well.
Yes.
Although
I loved that, the kind of continuation of that.
Yeah, although it's interesting because what happens is later on they actually found Julia's body and it's on the mattress and it's got the chains coming out of it. So I was curious as to sort of how that happened. It's sort of not very clear. It's one of the only things that isn't really very clear in the film as to what actually happened, whether Julia just had the box and she tried to open it and I don't know if the Cenobites just came for her or kind of what happened there. But yeah, somehow she ends up sort of skinless on her mattress at some point. And I always found that a bit confusing.
Yeah, I found that completely confusing as well. I wasn't sure how that had happened at all. It doesn't make sense because she's in the stairwell when he stabs her in the stomach.
Yeah, and he completely sucks like her essence or her life force, if we're talking about a different film, kind of from her. So it's a bit like, okay, I didn't really understand how that happened, but oh well.
The way that I kind of explained it away, like in my mind, was that maybe it was metaphorical. So he'd done that to her in the stairwell, and then metaphorically, that's where she'd ended up. So physically, she was then on the mattress because she'd gone to hell, but it kind of happened in the stairwell, and that was just some kind of representation of it. But I just don't think that they've portrayed that very well, how that happens, or maybe they had to cut a chunk out of the movie or something like that.
Yeah, maybe it just maybe as you say, it got lost in editing. And then finally, what we get in the last sort of is my favourite scene in the whole film, which is essentially where Frank accidentally outs himself in front of the Cenobites, and then they tear his soul apart.
Yeah, completely dismembered with the iconic chains.
Yes.
Which is amazing. And like in that room where most of these deaths occur, it's just a small setting, and a lot of the time, like when the Cenobites come through, there are a load of meat hooks and chains that kind of fall from the ceiling, which is so atmospheric, and like I just love those scenes. And then when Julia's taking people up to Frank, it's just kind of the dingy room. And then at one point, it's a dingy room with the mattress on the floor. So there's really not a lot there, but they just do so much with it. And like at the end, when he gets dismembered with the chains, it's literally like all the chains coming down from the ceiling, and then him kind of splayed out and gets torn up. And it's just still all in this one room in this little house in the UK. But it's just so effective. It is like a realm of hell, but just inside. Just a bedroom, just an empty bedroom that's really run down and stained.
Yes, and at this point we get my favourite line in the whole Hellraiser series, which is, "Jesus wept." And then commence tearing of flesh apart and explosions and shit. Yeah, it's fucking awesome. It's my favourite part of the whole film, the whole franchise. Love it.
So iconic when he says that. I believe at first they were going to say Jesus Christ, but he changed it to Jesus wept. I felt that it fitted more. Yeah, that was Andrew Robinson's idea. So he came up with that line. Very, very good choice, sir. Yeah. So, and then at this point, it kind of got to like my least favourite part of the film. So in the novella, what happens is, essentially, once Frank gets ripped apart and sort of taken back to hell, essentially the novella just ends. But what they did after this is essentially, instead of the Cenobites kind of keeping to their word and kind of just go, well, we got Frank, that's who we came for, and then we'll leave you alone, they kind of then try and get Kirsty, which, like I say, I never really liked this section of the film, even when I was younger. When I first saw it, I never thought this whole last sort of 10 minutes never really made sense to me. So essentially, Kirsty's got the box, and all the Cenobites are basically trying to get her. And there are some cool bits in it. Well, they do say to her, they say, "Oh, you're not leaving us so soon, are you?" And that's when the rest of this section of the film starts. But like you say, it's almost not needed because you've already got the satisfaction of that plot kind of being closed off. Like, I was already satisfied at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I was too. I just kind of felt a bit superfluous to me. But I think what happened was it was maybe the financiers, or not the producer, it would be the financiers who insisted on kind of having this, we need a girl because it's the 80s, it's, we've got slasher films, we need a girl being chased by someone at the end of the film and them getting away. So I guess that's
final
kind of
girl. Final girl moment.
Yeah, exactly. I do like the way when the female Cenobite is kind of going after Kirsty, how she drags her hook along the wall and the wall starts bleeding. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, very effective. Yeah.
So basically, Kirsty with the box sort of sends all the Cenobites back to wherever it is they're from, hell, I guess. Sends them back from there. And then this guy, Steve, who, as I said, is my least favourite character in the whole film, he turns up with his badly dubbed American accent. He almost gets killed about 3 times. And then what we get is, we talked about the effects earlier. Now, I think the effects hold up quite well. The only one that doesn't really hold up so well is the engineer, which is the monster that turns up a couple of times in the film. So it first turns up when Kirsty's at the hospital, and then it turns up right at the end of the film. And it just, I don't know, I didn't really like it. Again, I kind of get, because it is in the novella, but I don't know, it just looked a bit cheap.
Yeah, it did, and it really doesn't match up to the Cenobites, the quality of quality put into the Cenobites in detail. So, yeah, I guess it looked like they struggled with that one, but like you say, it can't be perfect because this was his first film, it was in the 80s. So it's just like everything else was just so on a better level than that effect. It doesn't quite match, does it?
Yeah, exactly. It was sort of a bit more similar to like Rawhead Rex, which I think is, as mentioned earlier, is kind of what Clive Barker was trying to get away from. Absolutely.
Yeah, and also, like you say, it's not really needed. It's like part of the film that you just think, I might choose to forget that bit because it's just nowhere near as good as the rest of the effects in there.
So then we have kind of the actual end of the film itself. So we've got Kirsty and Steve kind of escaping the house. And I always felt it was unclear kind of what happened. Apparently, I mean, judging from the sequel, the house didn't burn down, but it kind of looked as if the house did burn down. And then we have the ending, which I never really liked. I have a big thing about endings that I don't really like. And this is kind of one of them. It's just a bit, again, it doesn't really fit. It doesn't really feel necessary, where you've got, essentially, we've got the homeless man appearing again, and he turns into sort of a weird dragon-like creature, and then he takes the box away.
And then you're back at the beginning, back in the market, which we're not sure where that is. I was thinking like Arabia or something.
Yeah.
It's like some weird... Yeah, it's not... I mean, I know there's absinthe there, which must be a cultural kind of thing, but we're not sure where exactly that is, because you see absinthe next to the man and the box at the very beginning of the film, and I think it might be there at the end as well, so there's some indication to a cultural reference there. But yeah, you're back at the beginning, back at the market, the box is right back there again, it's looped back round, and you hear a voice saying, "What's your pleasure, sir?" again. So it is kind of satisfying how it loops back round, but it's like I say, after Frank gets dismembered towards the end of the film, all that kind of extra stuff is kind of, I don't really feel like it's as valuable, but it was still awesome. Like, I still just love this film so much, and aside from a couple of those effects at the end, which do look a little cheaper than the rest of the film, I think, like, it was very satisfying that it came back round to be concluded to the beginning again, where the puzzle box is right back out there for somebody else to pick it up, and obviously leaves it wide open for a sequel, or maybe 8 sequels, who knows?
Yes, I'm sure. Well, Clive Barker didn't have 8 sequels in mind when he made it, but oh well. So yeah, as we said, this is definitely, I mean, all sensible people kind of would say that this is the best one of the series. It's got the tightest narrative, it's got the best story, it uses the Cenobites kind of in the best way, I believe, because to me the Cenobites are kind of almost like a MacGuffin. They kind of just are there to kind of move the plot along, really. They don't really need to be there for any other purpose. In later films where we have sort of Pinhead as almost like the antagonist of the film, is kind of, I don't think that works as well, and Clive Barker agrees with me because that's also his opinion.
Yeah, I see what you mean, but it's like when you think of this film, which revolves around beings, supernatural beings coming from hell to take souls from Earth, it's really like you never really see their world, so how can you represent hell? So hell is never really shown, and that whole first film, the basis of this kind of place where you see elements of hell is just the spare room in a sort of semi-empty old house. So really the Cenobites are there to represent hell without you actually being shown hell. So you just keep being given a little piece of that by the beings coming out of there and then taking people back in. So what's great about that is that you can only imagine where they've come from by what they look like without actually seeing it. And all we see is a grubby, empty room, and we just imagine that they've just come from hell, which is, exactly like they are. It's going to be bleak, it's going to be gory, it's going to be full of pain, torture, mutilation. But we know that by the characters and not by actually seeing the place, which is awesome.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned that because the next year, Hellraiser came out and it did really well. So the budget was only just over $1 million, and based on kind of how well they thought the movie was going to play out, New World decided to finance a sequel, which is Hellbound Hellraiser 2. Now,
it's a great title.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a very, very evocative title. Now, Clive Barker couldn't actually direct. He stepped down from directing duties on this one. However, he did conceive the story with the screenwriter, who's Peter Atkins, who is another long-time friend and associate of Clive Barker's. But other than that, really, you have kind of the rest of the crew, including Christopher Young, who we didn't actually mention. He came up with a very iconic score, of which we have actually used some of it for our intro. It's a song called Seduction and Pursuit, is the name of the song that we use as our intro music. But yeah, it's a very iconic score.
Yeah, I mean, this film is so iconic that we based our whole podcast kind of persona and visuals and the name, the Lament configuration on that, on the basis that true fans of general horror would get the reference, and even if people didn't know that small reference to a classic cult film, then it still represents something that's about dissecting the parts of talking about horror. So this is just such an iconic film that we couldn't help name our podcast after it, basically.
Right. Exactly, we love it that much. So Hellbound Hellraiser 2 is directed by Tony Randall, he was uncredited as an editor on the first film, and he was brought in to direct. And yeah, essentially it's the same setup, and it's set literally straight after the events of the first film.
Yeah, so it's a 1988 film, so the very next year. And that was brought out. So obviously they brought that out quickly because of such a great response to the first one. And it's the institution film, set in an institution, and mainly based around Kirsty, being our final girl in the first film. They then set the film around her. So she's brought to an institution after the death of her family in the first film, where an occult obsessive head resurrects Julia, her stepmom, and unleashes the Cenobites once again.
Yes, so essentially this is kind of a very similar story to the first one. So it's the second film in a row where you have a character who wants to experience sort of, the pain and pleasure, and wants to do that by, unleashing the Cenobites and opening the box. And to do that, they resurrect a character who has previously passed away, so in this case, Julia. And you have sort of the Cenobites playing a smaller role again. And yeah, so quite similar to, interestingly, Halloween 2, which is also set in a hospital. You've got this film, which is set mainly in a psychiatric hospital, although you actually get to learn a bit more about the Cenobites, kind of where they came from originally. And also you actually get to see hell itself, which I think is probably the best parts of the film, is actually the effects work. So I really like the production design on this film. I really like the design of the actual labyrinth itself, where you've got Leviathan, who is very, very cool looking sort of... It's hard to describe what Leviathan actually is, but I thought he looked fucking awesome anyway, nonetheless. And you actually get to see how a Cenobite is made in this film.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed those elements of the human basis to the Cenobite, which explains a lot from the first film that you feel like could have been filled in. So that element of it is great.
Yes. Now, as a film as a whole, I kind of like this one. I don't like it as much as the first one, but of the sequels, I think it is the best one. It's kind of my sort of opinion. I mean, there are more bits of it I don't really like. I don't really like kind of a lot of the dialogue. There's a lot of what I think is unnecessary exposition given in this film, mostly by Kyle, who only seems to be in the film really to give exposition or to react to what's going on. That seems to be his sole purpose in the film. So when he died, I was actually quite happy because I thought he was a bit of a useless character.
I totally agree. And I think this is definitely the best sequel, but closely followed by the third one, which we'll come to on the next show, because I really enjoyed the third one as well, which I know some people don't like. But yeah, this is a sequel I feel it's obviously not as good as the first one, but it's a valuable sequel. I enjoyed it, and I do like the hospital setting and the idea of this doctor and the institute.
So yeah, story basically is Kirsty is in a hospital. It's the Chenard Institute, which is run by Dr. Chenard, who is played by Kenneth Cranham, who I think gives a really good performance in this. He's another sort of Shakespearean actor, very similar to Claire Higgins, and he's interested in Lament configuration, and he's got stuff on the history of the Cenobites and kind of where they come from, things like that. And to me, one of the best scenes in the film is where he brings back Julia through the mattress, where they have like a solitary confinement ward at this hospital, which is in sort of the basement, which reminded me a lot of Silence of the Lambs, actually. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I actually didn't think about that when I was watching it, but now that you've mentioned it, yes.
Oh, well, there you go. That's why I'm here. So basically, there's this one particular patient who is very, very eerie patient that believes his skin is being covered in maggots, and he keeps saying, "Get them off me! Get them off me!" And it's much, much more kind of grueling than I just did. Let's put it that way. And essentially, Chenard sets him up to cut himself, and he gets Julia back, basically, from hell.
Yeah, and so our straitjacket guy, who sees the maggots and is obviously cutting himself trying to get rid of these maggots, he's our first death in the film of 28 deaths.
Yeah, which is that's a lot of deaths. Yeah.
That's a lot of deaths, yeah. I think it only increases, or it possibly becomes more in some of the sequels, but from the first one, which just had 8, this was like they well upped their game, and it didn't feel like it was just for the sake of it, like it's just very dramatic and just keeps building, so I did enjoy this sequel. So 28 deaths. Our first one being our straitjacket guy. I believe his name is Browning, or he's referred to as that in the film.
Yes. And then after that, because what you have to bear in mind is video did not exist when this sequel was made. So obviously you had Hellraiser, and then I guess what they had to consider is that there would be people out there who hadn't seen the first film. So they kind of had to fill people in on what actually happened in the first film. So there's a kind of a 3 or 4 minute long sequence where basically it's Kirsty basically giving all this exposition about what happened in the first film. So we got that.
Oh yeah, I didn't like that, like just the use of all of the footage from the first film. Like, I felt like it was necessary in case people are seeing this and they weren't aware of the first one, because it'd only been out a year, so some people might have missed it or might not know about it and might see the second one on the off chance that it's just showing, so they'll go and check it out. But it was a lot of like footage from the first film used again, which always feels a bit lazy to me. But I guess it's, it's contextual, it's awesome scenes from the film, and it's a great summary, so maybe they needed to do or put all that in there, who knows.
And then after that we have loads of deaths, because Chenard is obviously trying to bring Julia back, so it's in a kind of repeat of the first film. Obviously they have to kill all these people in order to bring Julia back, so that's basically what happens.
Yeah, so there's like 7 institute patients, so that's deaths 2 to 8 of our 28 deaths in this film. And yeah, it's just kind of, you see them, you don't really realise how many it is because that happens fairly quickly, but you do see them hanging up later in the room, like quite a lot, when we're back in the same room as the first film.
Yeah, so all this is taking place at Dr. Chennard's house. Now, very interesting because Kyle actually works at the hospital itself, and he essentially sees all this because he sneaks into Chennard's house while Julia is sort of coming back through the mattress, and then he takes Kirsty to Chennard's house, and then Kyle, thankfully, dies.
Yeah, I wasn't too keen on him myself either, and how convenient that he works at the hospital, eh?
Well, yeah, exactly. You know, he's got all these clothes that you can give her, and like, you know, you can take her out, and no one notices that you've taken her out of the hospital. So that was great. And then basically, what happens is there's a character called Tiffany who is played by Imogen Borman, who is a kind of mute girl who's really, really good with puzzles.
Yeah, I did feel like I wasn't sure about that character at first, but then I did feel like it was quite a valid addition to the plot, in that she's like obsessed with puzzles and they've got the puzzle box, so it kind of makes sense to keep driving that home, and she is quite kind of creepy and you're intrigued by her character. What did you think to Tiffany?
Yeah, I wasn't sure about her either, but I guess having her in there does kind of make sense because you've got to bear in mind, obviously, there's no Larry. So Kirsty is in effect kind of become Larry. So Tiffany, I mean, is kind of almost like the new sort of Kirsty character. So she's kind of taken that role as such. So she's just there to solve puzzles, essentially.
Yeah, and I've noted down here that when Julia comes out of the mattress and she's, obviously starting to feed on these patients and everything, she's still power dressing and she's in a white suit this time, which is pretty nightmarish.
Yeah, I can imagine. Although at this point, before like Claire Higgins comes back, she is again played by a really, really skinny actress, basically covered in all this prosthetic sort of skinless makeup, which is very weird. So, although I don't know, I didn't notice to start off with that it actually wasn't Claire Higgins. I just assumed it was. So they fooled me. So if they can fool me, they can fool anyone.
Yeah, it does look quite like her. And then obviously as she builds up, as she feeds more, she fills out into the real Claire Higgins.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we get to see sort of what hell actually looks like. And if it's what hell looks like, sign me up, because hell looks really cool. So we've got lots of corridors, which I'm not going to lie, did kind of remind me of Knightmare, the kids' TV show. So you've got kind of all these sort of corridors that lead sort of to other corridors and lead to all these weird rooms where people see things, which is something that happens in a lot of the Hellraiser sequels, where people see things that aren't there.
Yeah, I thought it reminded me of Knightmare as well, actually.
Yes, we
love
needed
that TV show.
Yeah, me too. We just need Treguard in there. Although Pinhead is actually very, very similar to Treguard in a lot of ways. He does make these kind of very long, wordy sort of proclamations.
Yeah, essentially he's like the dungeon master, but
exactly,
he's master of hell instead.
So there you go. If you want to have an entertaining watch of this film, just imagine the same film but with Treguard as Pinhead, and it's there you go. So after that, the Cenobites appear again, and there's some slight controversy with this film because they changed the Chatterer Cenobites makeup, because in the first film it didn't have eyes, which meant that Nicholas Finch couldn't see where he was going, which is a bit of an impediment to good acting. So they gave the Chatterer Cenobite eyes in this one so that he could actually see, which was very not well received with some fans. I mean, I don't know about you. I mean, I kind of prefer it without eyes because it looks more eerie.
Yeah, I think it does look more eerie without the eyes too. But, I didn't mind them changing that too much because it's still the same character. But yeah, I did feel it was more eerie the first time around.
And then we get other scenes in Hell. Like, for example, Kirsty goes into a room where you've got all these beds covered in sheets, and there are writhing bodies under the sheets, which are covered in blood, which I thought was quite a cool effect. and which is when we get the return of Frank, because there's a scene earlier in the film which we haven't really explained, but basically Kirsty thinks that her dad is still in hell, and written in blood on the wall is "I am in hell, help me," which she assumes is from her dad, but it's actually from Frank, which, you know, makes sense. I recognised that it was Frank sort of straight away, but she didn't.
Yeah, I recognise that too, and I thought it was a very cool part of the film. The writhing bodies that you mentioned, that was an awesome part as well. There was also like a clown juggling eyeballs, and there's like this baby crying noise that's quite repetitive throughout the films, which I found really eerie. And it usually comes from an adult or some kind of monster, but they repeat this baby crying noise quite a lot. Did you pick up on that?
Yeah. So that's the scene in like the circus. It's sort of reminded me of the Funhouse, which we talked about on episode number 8, where it's all that kind of circus imagery. So I really like that. So after we get Frank, we get Dr. Chenard. He gets turned into a Cenobite, which is a scene that I really liked, where you get to see sort of, you know, all the pain that people go through, like when they get turned into a Cenobite. So he gets all this kind of barbed wire or cheese wire pressed against his head, which looks very nasty. And you get his blood gets drained out of his body and replaced with a blue liquid, which kind of makes sense because when he comes back in his Cenobite form, his face is all blue. And he has what appears to be a giant dick sort of stuck out of his head, which is a bit unfortunate. But, oh well. And he makes these very, very, like, very scary kind of gargly sort of noises, like ah, like that, kind of those very, very scary noises.
Yeah, and he's got these kind of like weird bits that shoot out of him and these eyeballs and different things. And he's just in like kind of floating around in quite an odd posture. He keeps sort of like flying out of walls and things.
Yeah, so we got like, as you said, he's got these tentacles, which how they do it is they do it using stop motion animation, which is kind of cool. They would definitely do it with CGI now. I don't know. You could argue that it would look better if they did it in CGI. But as you said, he's got all these tentacles that have these different openings and the flowers or knives or a finger at one point and stuff like that.
Yeah, that was creepy. The finger that comes out of there that really freaked me out. Like with this insight into how he gets made into a Cenobite, which, like you say, is really cool. You also have a bit at the beginning where you see kind of Pinhead being created, where they're actually putting the pins in and etching the lines into his skin with the knife, which I found really cool. So, like you say, it's filling in those gaps from the first film, which is where we're just showing the characters in the first one, whereas here it's like, well, where did they come from and how do they end up in that form? Which, you know, it just explains a little bit more of the backstory that you would want to know about as a fan.
Yeah, exactly. So post Kyle, what deaths did you have?
Okay, so I have...
well, we have Frank, didn't we? Because obviously what happens when we're in hell with Frank is that Julia, who we haven't really talked about much, she kind of gets revenge on Frank from the first movie with the Nothing Personal Babe.
Yeah. So death number 11. So death number 10 is Kyle. Death number 11, Julia kills Frank and she says nothing personal, babe. And then after that, our next death is actually Julia herself.
Yes. So what happens is, like, because of the Chenard Cenobite, there's this huge kind of reaction in the Labyrinth, because Leviathan is very pissed off, and there's essentially a huge wind tunnel created, and Julia, like, you know, she essentially gets her skin ripped off, which can't be very nice. Very, very grisly.
She gets pulled into a hell portal.
Yeah,
and it
basically.
is so grisly. And as you say, like that actress that plays the skinless version of her is like skinnier than her. So she's like, just as you know with Frank, she's like red from head to toe, and you know, has that sort of inside out look about her that a lot of the characters in these films do.
Mm. And then Kirsty and Tiffany end up back at the hospital through the Labyrinth, and then the Chenard Cenobite appears and he utters the immortal line, "The Doctor," is in, which I love.
Yeah, it's a cool scene that when he kind of flies in through the wall and it's very menacing.
Yeah.
Yeah, they totally get away with that line without making it too cheesy as well.
Yes. Now, this is interesting because when we talk about Hellraiser 3, there is a very, very fine line when you're cutting all these lines between cool and cheesy. And I think Treguard gets away with it really well because he does have all these really cool lines. Another one which I love is like, I recommend amputation, which is great.
Yeah, somehow it manages to not be cheesy, and I totally expected it to be. But yeah, they did really well with that. His delivery is great.
Yeah, so yeah, that's Kenneth Branagh. So I say he gives a really, really good performance. He is probably the highlight of the film, I would say. Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, like you say about the Leviathan and the Labyrinth, and these sort of areas that look like the TV show Knightmare. It also made me think of like Maze Runner and also that David Bowie film Labyrinth, but not quite as friendly. But it does have that kind of dungeon-esque sort of feeling to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what happens is we get a scene with the Cenobites where we get this epic standoff, or at least what we think is going to be an epic standoff between the 4 Cenobites and Treguard, who's like the new kid on the block, so to speak. And I thought this was a bit of a letdown. I don't know about you, because all the four Cenobites from the previous film, they all kind of just die very, very quickly and very easily. There's like no struggle whatsoever, basically.
Yeah, it was a little bit disappointing. So you have the 10 Institute patients, apparently it's 10. So after Julia, it's like Death 13 to 22 is like 10 patients. And then Death 23, the first of the original Cenobites, is Butterball, who, like you say, is the kind of the roly-poly fat guy.
It's the Michelin Man, Cenobite.
Yeah, it's very creepy looking, actually. Although he's not got, like, exposed skin like the other Cenobites have, but he's very creepy looking. He doesn't do an awful lot either, but still manages to look very menacing.
He is just there to look fat and menacing, exactly as you say.
Yeah. Then it's, so Death 24 is the female Cenobite. So all of these Cenobites just get a metal rod thrown into their chest and they're just impaled, and it's just over very quickly, like you say, which is potentially a little disappointing, but at this point, it's getting quite late in the film, I think.
Yeah, and what happens is when they die, they revert back to their original human form. So the first two, like, it's pretty sort of self-explanatory, like it's just a fat guy and a woman. But then when we get the Chatterer, who's the next one to die, it turns out his human form was a boy, which is very, very weird that he was, very eerie.
That's really confusing and very strange, yeah, I wasn't sure about that.
Yeah. Although Nicholas Vince apparently in interviews, he said that he didn't mind that it was a small boy.
Oh, okay.
And then finally we get sort of Pinhead himself. Now he is the only, when they revert back to their human forms, he is the only person where it's the actor playing the Cenobite that is in human form, because obviously Doug Bradley is sort of very iconic and he looks a certain way. And you've seen his picture. So,
yeah, and obviously the use of his voice, which they could have dubbed, but it's going to be more natural if they use that the same way.
Yes. So, and they all die. Now, from this point, one of the other issues that I have with this film is it's more in the narrative, because in comparison to the previous film, which had a very straightforward narrative with maybe sort of, only really 4 characters and then the Cenobites, we have all these different characters and they all have different relationships to each other. So you've got Kirsty and you've got Julia, then you've got Kirsty and Tiffany, you've got Kirsty and Treguard, you've got Julia and Treguard, you've got Tiffany and Treguard, and then you've got Frank who appears, and you've got all these different characters who just turn up, and it just gets very, very confusing after a while.
Yeah, it does get confusing. And like I say, there's such a lot of deaths in this film. It was like a struggle to kind of separate which ones were there and which one. Because, like, let's not forget the Cenobites are already dead, so then they get killed off kind of again and go back to being human, so it does get a little confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then after that, we get Treguard himself, who dies.
Yeah, so Death 26 was Pinhead. Death 27 is Chenard, our doctor, and he is decapitated. His head's pulled off from Leviathan, and it's just kind of dropped into the Labyrinth abyss.
Yeah.
He's kind of dropped in there.
Yeah, he gets decapitated by the giant penis attached to his head.
Yes, that's what it would look like. And we got what? Yeah, it's a cool ending. Like, there's a lot of build up to this. And as always, like so Pinhead has already died, and then one of our other main characters and main monsters, the Doctor's died, and it's kind of disappointing because the film's coming to an end, but that's how it goes in these films, as we learn throughout the franchise.
Yeah.
We have one more death left, which is
Yes.
Death 28.
Which is
A removal man. So we're still in the same house with the same shabby rooms, and a removal man shows up.
Yes. Before that, we have like a very, very weird ending, sort of where essentially Tiffany has kind of changed the Lament configuration into like a giant diamond shape to match sort of the shape of Leviathan, and then essentially she thinks that Julia is trying to save her, but it's actually Kirsty wearing Julia's skin who seduces Chenard and then sort of saves Tiffany and then takes the skin off, and it's actually Kirsty. And then there's just a great big long chase scene, and Leviathan gets really pissed off and fires all these lightning bolts everywhere, and they basically get out. And there, yeah, as you say, you get the scene. It's actually at Chenard's house where the removal man... Now, it's interesting. It's actually the same removal man from Hellraiser. So...
Oh, no way. That's cool.
It is the same removal man, and he gets dragged into the mattress by, well, it's hard to say. Originally, as I mentioned earlier, it was supposed to be Julia, but Claire Higgins didn't want to appear in any more movies, so instead of it being a person, we get the Pillar of Souls, which emerges, which is the big statue with all the Cenobites and the homeless person from the first film all kind of trapped in it.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because it kind of looks like some kind of interpretive art sculpture, like someone's art project that should be in a gallery.
Well,
and then yeah, it's just kind of a theme that then starts running throughout Hellraiser, that these objects that are like portals to hell could also be beautiful things that people mistake for art. So this Pillar of Souls is really something very strange looking out. Wasn't sure about the concept and whether I liked it at first, but it does work.
Yeah. I really like the look of it, and compared to how it looks in Hellraiser 3, I actually think it looked really cool. And yeah, it was just it was kind of just a way, I think, to kind of go into a sequel, because I think they knew again that there probably would be another sequel, so it's just setting that up really. So yeah, overall, just to sum up, what do you think?
The sequel was as I thought it would be, not as good as the first one, which is very difficult to touch because up until that point I hadn't seen anything like that. It answers a lot of questions from the first one, which I think they did very well. Like you say with the removal man at the end, he's bisected by chains again from the Pillar of Souls, so it's got a great ending. A little confusing, which I think is because like you say, the plot in the first film was so tight that this one does get quite confusing, but overall I really liked it. So yeah, it's up there. Like, first one is my favourite. I think the second one is my second favourite, so they did well with that.
Yeah, and it helps. As I said, it was Clive Barker was very heavily involved. I mean, he helped with the story, so there was a continuity from the first film, and they used, I say, a lot of the main kind of behind the scenes people were there. So it had, the same producer, the same special effects people, the same editor, the same music, things like that. So yeah, it really helped. And yeah, of all the sequels, I'd say this is the best by far. And as I say, it's not a perfect film. As I mentioned earlier, I have issues with like the exposition, some of the dialogue. The effects in this one are pretty good, and they're definitely sort of the high point, particularly the bits with the Cenobite. That's definitely the highlight of the film for me. Story a bit confusing, sort of too many loose ends. Think you could have done with a tighter narrative. But other than that, it's very enjoyable. And really, if you're going to watch any of the films, you only really need to watch these two, if I'm being honest. The others are if you absolutely love Hellraiser. If you're not a Hellraiser fanatic, the first two films are sufficient, I believe.
I would agree with you in that I think with the continuation they bring the most value to the plot, and then everything after that, if you enjoy it, then it's a bonus. And it's like I said when we get round to talking about the rest of them, I did really enjoy the third one, so I recommend 1 to 3 on this. But yeah, 1 and 2 like really stand out as the best films for me.
Yes, absolutely. So we've come to the end of part 1 of our discussion of Hellraiser and the series. So thank you very much. As I said, my name is Greg Knox, and I want to thank everyone for listening to the show and for subscribing to us on iTunes or liking our Facebook page or subscribing to us on YouTube. We are also available on Podbean, and we are also available on TuneIn Radio, which I think is really cool because I love TuneIn Radio. I use it to listen to the radio because I actually don't have one in my house, so if I want to listen to the radio, that's what I do. So you can like our podcast on there as well should you wish to do so.
Yeah, and as Greg said, I've been resident body count girl Reoffend, alternative model, and also host of the Lament Configuration. So all the same social media channels apply for Lament Configuration. Thank you for all the feedback and the messages. We really love getting comments on the content of the show and which bits you find funny, so thanks very much for letting me know about that via direct message. My alternative modelling pages are on Facebook as Reoffend, that's F-E-N-D, and I'm on Instagram and Twitter as Ria_Fend.
Cool. So on the next show, we're going to be covering the remaining 7, because there's quite a lot of them, sequels.
Yeah, what a marathon that was. 9 films.
Yes, although it's not actually the franchise with the most sequels, but that's fine. It's still 9 is quite a lot. It's pretty excessive stuff.
That sounds like you're laying down the gauntlet with this other franchise with more sequels, to be fair. I like a challenge. Yes, the Amityville Horror has 16 films. We are not doing all 16 films for that. That's ridiculous. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the show. I look forward to the next one. And if you really, really excited, want to know what you think, don't be upset. We will be back in 2 weeks' time. Yeah, so no tears, please. It's a waste of good suffering. And in a fortnight's time, we'll be back with the next episode of the Hellraiser special, which covers films 3 to 9 in the sequels in the Hellraiser franchise.